In the summer of 1966, the quiet ranching community of Bitter Creek, Nevada, was unsettled by the disappearance of two children. Roy and Ray Morrison, 8-year-old twins with matching cowlicks and gap-toothed grins, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their laughter echoing in memory. But 19 years later, when ranch hand Carlos Mendez stumbles upon a hidden shrine in the desert scrub, he uncovers a truth so disturbing it would unravel the very fabric of rural trust and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The celebration had begun at dawn on that scorching July day. Big Bill Carver's Double C Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of sagebrush and alkali flats, and the annual summer gathering brought together ranch hands, their families and neighbors from miles around. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from sun-baked earth, carrying the mingled scents of barbecue smoke, horse sweat, and desert wildflowers. Roy and Ray darted between the adults like quicksilver, their identical faces flushed with excitement. Their father, Hank Morrison, foreman of the Double C, watched them with bloodshot eyes that betrayed too many sleepless nights and too much whiskey. His wife had left him the previous spring, unable to bear his increasingly erratic behavior and wild talk of spiritual salvation. "Boys need structure," Martha Willows had murmured that morning, ladling scrambled eggs onto paper plates with practiced efficiency. The ranch cook moved through the crowd like a shadow, her greying hair pulled back in a tight bun, her weathered hands steady as she served the gathered families. Nobody paid much attention to Martha. She was simply there, reliable as sunrise feeding whoever needed feeding. The celebration continued as the sun climbed higher. Children played horseshoes in the dust, while adults clustered in whatever shade they could find. Moonbeam Rodriguez, the spiritual healer who'd taken up residence in an old line shack, performed a blessing ceremony near the ancient petroglyphs that marked the northern boundary of the ranch. Her turquoise jewelry caught the light as she burned sage and spoke of harmony between earth and sky. As evening approached and the bonfire was lit, someone noticed the Morrison twins were missing. The flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows across faces creased with sudden worry. Calls of "Roy Ray" echoed across the darkening landscape, but only silence answered back. By midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, the harsh truth settled over the gathering like desert cold: the boys were gone. The search began before dawn. Flashlight beams swept across the desert floor like fallen stars, illuminating patches of scrub brush and scattered stones. Every gully, every outcropping, every shadow that might conceal two small boys drew the attention of the growing search party. Sheriff Wade Hutchins had driven out from town with 3 deputies, their voices crackling over radio static as they coordinated the expanding grid pattern. Hank Morrison stumbled through the search like a man possessed, calling his sons' names until his voice cracked to a whisper. Big Bill Carver rode his aging gelding along the fence lines, checking for breaks in the wire that might indicate the direction the boys had taken. Even Moonbeam joined the effort, her face grave, as she consulted what she called the spirits of the land for guidance. It was Martha who found them first, or rather, what they had left behind. She had walked farther north than most, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name toward the cluster of ancient petroglyphs that marked where Paiute hunters had once carved their stories into volcanic rock. The symbols, spirals, and figures and animals seemed to watch her approach through the pre-dawn gloom. At the base of the largest boulder, something glinted in her flashlight beam. The boots sat perfectly upright, as if the boys had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the desert. Roy's on the left, Ray's on the right, their small leather soles barely scuffed from months of summer play. But what made Martha's breath catch in her throat was the arrangement surrounding them. Crystals formed a precise circle around the boots, clear quartz amethyst and turquoise stones that caught and scattered the flashlight beam like trapped stars. Bundles of sage burned to ash at the tips lay between each crystal in careful placement. The entire pattern measured perhaps 6 feet across its symmetry, too perfect to be accidental, too deliberate to be child's play. Martha stood frozen at the circle's edge, her weathered hands trembling as she raised the flashlight higher. The petroglyphs seemed to leer down at her from the rock face, their ancient meanings suddenly sinister in the growing light. She opened her mouth to call for the others, but only a small, choked sound emerged. When the search party finally reached her, drawn by her silence rather than any shout, they found Martha kneeling beside the circle, with tears streaming down her face, whispering prayers to a God she hoped was still listening. The discovery of the ritualistic circle transformed the investigation from a simple missing persons case into something far more ominous. Sheriff Hutchins photographed every crystal, every burned sage bundle, every inch of the precise arrangement before allowing anyone to disturb the scene. The boots were bagged as evidence, their small size a stark reminder of how young and vulnerable the missing boys truly were. But even as the search expanded and the FBI was contacted, whispers began to circulate about Big Bill Carver and his
Sheriff,
increasingly desperate financial situation.
Calm down, Bill.
The Double C Ranch, once a symbol of prosperity in the high desert, had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years running. Cattle prices had plummeted, drought had withered the grazing land, and Bill's gambling habits in Reno had accelerated his descent toward bankruptcy. The insurance investigator had arrived just 2 weeks before the twins' disappearance. Harold Klemp, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit, had spent days examining the rancher's books and asking pointed questions about a suspicious barn fire the previous winter. The fire had destroyed feed stores worth $30,000 money Bill desperately needed to keep his creditors at bay. "Timing's awful convenient, don't you think?" Deputy Morrison had muttered to Sheriff Hutchins as they watched Klemp measure scorch marks on the barn's concrete foundation. The investigators' pale eyes had missed nothing, cataloguing every inconsistency in Bill's story about faulty wiring and hay that had spontaneously combusted. Now, with the twins missing and that eerie circle discovered, those same whispers took on a darker edge. Had Big Bill's desperation driven him to stage something even more dramatic? The insurance policy on the ranch included provisions for catastrophic loss, including harm to residents. The payout would be substantial, more than enough to clear his debts and start fresh somewhere else. Martha noticed how the men's voices dropped when Bill approached, how conversations died when he entered a room. She served coffee to the search teams with steady hands, but her eyes tracked the ranch owner's every movement. Something about his nervous energy, the way he kept checking his watch and glancing toward the road, struck her as wrong. Not grief calculation. "Poor man's beside himself," she murmured to Moonbeam as they prepared sandwiches for the volunteers. But her tone carried an odd inflection, almost clinical in its observation. "Guilt does terrible things to a person's appetite." Moonbeam nodded absently, too focused on her own theories about spiritual warfare to catch the strange precision in Martha's words. Moonbeam Rodriguez had arrived at the Double C Ranch 6 months earlier, traveling in a converted school bus painted with sacred symbols and trailing the sweet smoke of burning herbs. She claimed Cherokee ancestry through her grandmother, though her dark eyes and sharp cheekbones suggested a more complex heritage. Big Bill had allowed her to settle in the abandoned line shack near the petroglyphs, drawn by her promises of spiritual healing for his troubled ranch hands. Her ceremonies had begun simply enough: sage smudging for newcomers, crystal meditation circles for the wives, dealing with isolation and hardship. But as the ranch's financial pressures mounted and tempers grew short, Moonbeam's methods had intensified. She spoke increasingly of blood debts that needed settling, of ancient spirits demanding appeasement for the disruption of sacred land. The week before the twins disappeared, She had conducted what she called a cleansing ritual for the Hendricks family after their teenage son had been arrested for stealing cattle. The ceremony lasted from sunset to dawn, involving drums, chanting, and substances Moonbeam claimed were blessed peyote buttons given to her by a Navajo medicine man. Martha had observed these sessions with growing concern, standing at the edge of the firelight with a thermos of coffee for anyone who needed warming. Her trained eye, honed by years of watching for signs of food poisoning or heat exhaustion among the ranch hands, noted the dilated pupils, the erratic breathing, the way participants stumbled when the ceremony finally ended. "Dangerous combination," Martha had murmured to Sheriff Hutchins when he questioned her about Moonbeam's activities. "Mixing traditional practices with modern desperation. People do things under influence they'd never consider sober." Her medical vocabulary seemed oddly precise for a ranch cook, but Hutchins was too focused on potential drug charges to notice. Moonbeam's reaction to the twins' disappearance had been theatrical and immediate. She'd thrown herself onto the ground near the crystal circle, claiming to commune with the spirits who had taken the boys. Her wailing had echoed off the petroglyphs while she spoke of spiritual warfare between light and darkness of innocent blood being required to restore cosmic balance. "The earth calls for justice," she'd proclaimed, her voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. "The old ways demand recognition. Children are conduits, pure vessels the spirits can use to send messages." Those who watched her performance found it either deeply moving or deeply disturbing. Martha, observing from her usual position at the gathering's edge, had tilted her head with clinical interest as if studying a particularly fascinating specimen. Hank Morrison had not slept since his boys vanished. He moved through the search efforts like a man walking underwater. His movements sluggish and his speech slurred from the whiskey he carried in a dented flask. The other searchers gave him wide berth, disturbed by the way he muttered to himself as he stumbled through the desert scrub. In the days following the discovery of the crystal circle, Hank's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would stand for hours at the petroglyphs, staring at the ancient symbols as if they might reveal his son's location. His conversations became fragmented, jumping between memories of the boys and rambling theories about spiritual debts. "Blood calls to blood," he said one evening, cornering Deputy Morrison outside the ranch house. His eyes were wild, unfocused. "The land's been angry for years. All this drilling, all this fencing, we took what wasn't ours to take. Now it wants payment." The deputy had backed away slowly, one hand resting on his service weapon. Hank's reputation as a hard worker and devoted father was crumbling under the weight of his obvious breakdown. Neighbours whispered about his late-night visits to the cemetery where Paiute remains had been unearthed during a well-digging project 2 years earlier. Martha watched these performances with careful attention, noting the tremor in Hank's hands and the way his speech patterns deteriorated as the alcohol took hold. When she served him coffee black the way he'd always preferred, she observed how he held the cup, how his pupils responded to light, how his breathing changed when certain topics arose. "Man's eaten up with guilt," she told Sheriff Hutchins during one of his interviews. "Keeps talking about sacrifices being necessary, about the old ways demanding their due. Makes a person wonder what he might have thought necessary to save this place." Her words carried the weight of careful observation, delivered in the same measured tone she used to describe spoiled meat or a recipe gone wrong. Hutchins scribbled notes, finding Martha's clinical assessment more useful than the emotional reactions of other witnesses. 3 days after the boys disappeared, Hank was found passed out near the crystal circle at dawn, an empty whiskey bottle beside him, and his hands stained with what looked like dried blood. When questioned about the stains, he claimed he'd cut himself on the rocks while trying to commune with whatever had taken his sons. The blood tested as bovine from a recent cattle butchering, but the incident cemented Hank's position as the investigation's primary suspect. In the chaos that followed the twins' disappearance, Martha Willows became the ranch's steady anchor. While searchers stumbled through the desert and investigators asked their pointed questions, she maintained the rhythm of daily meals with unwavering precision. Coffee at 5 in the morning for the early search teams, hearty breakfasts that no one had appetite for, but everyone needed, and sandwiches packed with care for those who wouldn't return until after dark. Her kitchen occupied the back wing of the ranch house, a domain she'd ruled quietly for 7 years. The walls were lined with mason jars containing dried herbs, chamomile for sleeplessness, willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds that wouldn't heal. She'd learned their properties during her years working at the state hospital before coming to the ranch back when medicine meant more than just pills and procedures. Martha's got healing hands. Big Bill often said, though he never quite looked at her when he spoke. She was the kind of woman people forgot they'd seen 5 minutes after she left the room. Average height, greying brown hair, always pulled back, clothes that never quite fit properly. Invisible in the way that middle-aged women who fed others often became. But those who paid attention noticed her unusual knowledge. When young Tommy Hendricks had fallen from his horse and dislocated his shoulder, Martha had reset the joint with professional competence before the doctor arrived. When Maria Santos suffered a miscarriage, Martha had prepared a tea that eased both physical pain and emotional anguish. Her movements around injury and illness carried the confidence of formal training. "Where'd you learn medicine?" Sheriff Hutchins had asked during one of his routine interviews, more curious than suspicious. "Here and there," Martha had replied, her hands never pausing as she kneaded bread dough. "You pick things up when you care about people's welfare. Body tells you what it needs if you know how to listen." She'd been especially attentive to the Morrison boys during their visits to the ranch. Their father's drinking had left them hungry more often than not, and Martha always seemed to have fresh-baked cookies or leftover stew available when they appeared in her kitchen doorway. She'd taught them to identify edible plants, shown them which mushrooms were safe and which would cause visions, or worse. Boys need to understand nature, she'd explained to anyone who'd listen. Too many children these days don't know what the earth provides. Knowledge like that, it's sacred, powerful. Now, with Roy and Ray gone, Martha's grief seemed as genuine as anyone's. She spoke to their memory while she cooked, her voice soft with affection for the 2 small lives that had brightened her solitary existence. 19 years passed like wind across the high desert, wearing away the sharp edges of memory, but leaving the essential mystery intact. The Double C Ranch had changed hands twice after Big Bill Carver's death from a heart attack in 1973, his creditors finally claiming what the insurance investigators never could prove he'd stolen. The new owners, a California investment group, had modernized the operation with updated equipment and younger staff, but the land itself remained unchanged, vast, unforgiving, and keeper of secrets. Carlos Mendez had worked the ranch for 3 years, arriving from Arizona with strong hands and few questions about the place's darker history. At 28, he possessed the kind of steady competence that made him valuable to any ranching operation. He knew cattle, understood machinery, and could work long hours under the desert sun without complaint. The old-timers still talked about the Morrison twins, sometimes usually late at night when the whiskey loosened their tongues. They'd mention the Crystal Circle, the insurance investigation, and poor Hank Morrison's suicide 6 months after his boys disappeared. The official story had never quite satisfied anyone. Too many loose ends, too many questions left unanswered. Moonbeam Rodriguez had vanished shortly after the FBI questioned her about the ritual circle taking her converted bus and her mysterious ceremonies to some other desperate community. Big Bill had maintained his innocence until his dying day, though the insurance money had somehow disappeared into offshore accounts that investigators never quite managed to trace. Martha Willows had stayed on through the ownership changes, her cooking skills and institutional knowledge making her too valuable to dismiss. She'd aged gracefully into her 60s, her hair gone completely silver and her movements slightly slower, but her meals remained as nourishing and her manner as quietly efficient as ever. The new workers accepted her presence the way they accepted the sagebrush and the ancient petroglyphs, part of the landscape, permanent and unremarkable. Carlos had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, brief exchanges about meal schedules or dietary preferences. She struck him as harmless, even kindly, often leaving extra portions in the bunkhouse kitchen for workers pulling late shifts. Her herbal remedies still appeared when someone fell sick, and her knowledge of the desert's medicinal plants impressed even the most skeptical cowboys. It was routine fence repair that led Carlos to his discovery, a section of wire damaged by winter storms and summer heat located near the northern boundary, where the petroglyphs cast their ancient shadows across the alkali flats. The fence post had been deliberately loosened, its concrete foundation chipped away with methodical precision. Carlos discovered this as he examined why the wire sagged at that particular spot, his practiced eye noting tool marks that spoke of human intention rather than natural weathering. The damaged post stood 20 yards from the largest petroglyph boulder, close enough to the ancient site to seem coincidental. Following his instincts, Carlos began probing the ground around the post with his shovel. 3 feet down, the blade struck something that wasn't rock or hardpan, something that rustled with the hollow sound of buried metal. Working carefully in the growing heat of the afternoon, he uncovered a rusted ammunition box, its military surplus origin evident from the faded stenciling on its sides. Inside, wrapped in layers of deteriorating plastic, lay the remnants of a mystery that had haunted the high desert for nearly 2 decades. The Morrison twins' belongings were arranged with the same ritualistic precision that had marked the original crystal circle. Their small belt buckles, tarnished but recognizable. Roy's lucky rabbit's foot still attached to its keychain. Ray's collection of interesting stones, each one labelled in a child's careful printing. A photograph of both boys on horseback, their identical grins frozen in sepia tones. Beneath these heartbreaking mementos, Carlos found documents that transformed the tragedy into something more sinister. Insurance papers bearing Big Bill Carver's forged signature detailing policy amendments that would have paid substantial sums for accidental death or disappearance of ranch residents. The modifications had been made just weeks before the twins vanished, the ink still bold, despite years of burial. But it was Hank Morrison's handwritten confession that made Carlos's hands tremble as he read. The note, scrawled in increasingly erratic penmanship, detailed his descent into what he called necessary madness. He wrote of consultations with spiritual advisors, of ceremonies requiring innocent blood, of ancient debts that could only be paid through ultimate sacrifice. The land demands its due, the note concluded. Spiritual requirements cannot be ignored. The boys understood their purpose in the end. Martha helped them understand. That final line stood alone at the bottom of the page, almost an afterthought. Carlos read it 3 times before its significance began to penetrate his shock. Martha, the quiet cook, who still served meals at the ranch, who had found the original crystal circle, who had been there all along. His radio crackled to life with afternoon check-ins from other workers, the sound startling him back to the present moment, and the terrible discovery spread across the desert floor. Sheriff Hutchins had retired long ago, but his replacement, Sheriff Maria Santos, arrived at the scene within an hour of Carlos's radio call. The discovered cache painted a picture that was both horrifying and grimly logical, a conspiracy of desperation that had claimed 2 innocent lives. The evidence seemed to tell its story with brutal clarity. Big Bill Carver's insurance fraud, documented in meticulous detail, revealed a man drowning in debt who saw profit in tragedy. The policy modifications showed careful planning with clauses that would pay double for deaths involving ritualistic circumstances, or native spiritual sites, language so specific it could only have been crafted with foreknowledge. Hank Morrison's confession provided the missing psychological component. His guilt-ridden rambling about spiritual requirements and blood sacrifices aligned perfectly with witness accounts of his deteriorating mental state. The note described meetings with the spiritual advisor, who had convinced him that his son's deaths would somehow save the ranch, that ancient spirits demanded tribute for the family to prosper. Moonbeam Rodriguez emerged as the manipulation's architect. Her influence over both men was documented in diary entries found among Hank's papers sessions, where she'd fed his desperation with talk of cosmic balance and necessary sacrifice. The timing of her arrival at the ranch, 6 months before the disappearance, suggested careful planning rather than coincidence. She played them perfectly, Sheriff Santos concluded as she studied the evidence spread across the evidence table. Convinced a drunk, grieving father that killing his children would save his livelihood while providing the spiritual theatre to cover Carver's insurance scam. The conspiracy theory satisfied everyone involved. It explained Moonbeam's dramatic performance at the Crystal Circle, her convenient disappearance when federal investigators arrived, and the ritualistic elements that had confused the original investigation. Big Bill's subsequent heart attack could have been guilt-induced stress from watching his scheme unravel. Carlos found himself reluctantly agreeing with the reconstruction, though something nagged at the edges of his consciousness. The confession's handwriting had deteriorated as it progressed, suggesting Hank had been intoxicated while writing. But certain phrases, particularly the clinical descriptions of the boy's final moments, seemed oddly precise for a man consumed by alcohol and grief. Martha's name in the confession felt almost parenthetical, as if added by someone else entirely. When Carlos mentioned this observation to Sheriff Santos, she dismissed it as the rambling of a man whose sanity had completely shattered. "Poor woman probably tried to talk sense into him," Santos said. "Can't imagine what it was like watching those children disappear, knowing what their own father had planned." It was Carlos who noticed the second compartment. As he carefully repacked the evidence for transport to the sheriff's office, his fingers detected a slight unevenness in the ammunition box's base. A false bottom, expertly crafted, but not quite perfect, revealed itself under closer inspection. The hidden section contained a single manila folder, its contents protected by multiple layers of plastic wrap. Inside, medical records yellowed with age told a story that no one had thought to investigate 19 years earlier. The documents bore the letterhead of Nevada State Hospital, dated from 1963 to 1965. Patient name, Martha Elizabeth Willows. Diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, with religious and ritualistic delusions. The clinical notes painted a disturbing picture of a woman whose grip on reality had been tenuous even before her arrival at the Double C Ranch. Dr. Frederick Hawthorne's assessment was brutally direct. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of command hallucinations, believing herself to be receiving divine instructions through various means, including auditory voices and visual manifestations. Particularly concerning is her fixation on child sacrifice as spiritual purification drawn from her fragmented understanding of various religious traditions. The treatment notes documented Martha's response to early antipsychotic medications, initially positive, then declining as she began hiding pills and eventually refusing treatment entirely. Her discharge summary, dated just 3 months before she'd appeared at the ranch seeking employment, noted her superficial compliance with treatment protocols and skilled ability to present as functionally normal during brief interactions. Most chilling was the addendum from 1964. Patient has begun self-medicating with various plant substances, claiming they provide clearer communication with spiritual guides. Analysis of her possessions revealed peyote buttons, which she insists are necessary for proper understanding of divine requirements. Strongly recommend continued hospitalization, but patient has legal right to refuse treatment. Carlos's hands trembled as he read Dr. Hawthorne's final note. Patient demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants and their psychoactive properties. Her ability to maintain surface normalcy while experiencing severe delusions makes her extremely dangerous to vulnerable populations, particularly children. She views young people as pure vessels suitable for spiritual purposes. The folder also contained newspaper clippings from Martha's time before the hospital missing children cases from 3 different counties, all unsolved, all involving ritualistic elements that the investigating officers had attributed to satanic cults or hippie communes. In each clipping, someone had circled mentions of community members who'd tried to help with the search efforts. Someone who'd cooked meals for the searchers, someone who'd been quietly helpful, someone whose name appeared in the background of each tragedy invisible until you knew to look. The horrifying truth revealed itself with the systematic precision of Martha's own planning. As Sheriff Santos studied the medical records alongside the previously discovered evidence, the careful construction of an elaborate frame became apparent. Martha Willows hadn't been a peripheral witness to tragedy, she had been its architect. Her self-medication with peyote documented in the hospital records had not provided the spiritual clarity she'd sought. Instead, the hallucinogenic cactus had amplified her existing delusions, feeding her conviction that divine voices demanded child sacrifice for cosmic balance. Her untreated schizophrenia had created a complex mythology where she served as an instrument of higher purpose. The evidence cache told a different story when viewed through this lens. Martha's medical training, evident in her precise handling of injuries, and her extensive knowledge of plant medicines had extended to forgery and psychological manipulation. Hank Morrison's confession showed signs of having been written under severe influence, not just alcohol, but the consciousness-altering substances Martha had been slipping into his coffee for weeks. The insurance papers bore Big Bill's signature, but handwriting analysis would likely reveal Martha's careful forgery. Her years of watching him sign documents, of serving him meals while he conducted business, had provided ample opportunity to study and replicate his distinctive penmanship. The policy modifications had been her innovation, designed to provide a financial motive that would obscure the true delusional reasoning behind the children's deaths. Moonbeam Rodriguez had been an unwitting accomplice, her dramatic spiritual performances providing perfect cover for Martha's more sinister rituals. The crystal circle discovered after the twins' disappearance had been Martha's creation. She'd found it because she'd arranged it using her knowledge of both the boys' whereabouts and the symbolic elements that would suggest outside spiritual interference. Her position as the ranch cook had rendered her effectively invisible. People saw the meals she prepared, the remedies she provided, the quiet efficiency with which she maintained her domain. They failed to see the calculating intelligence that studied their weaknesses, catalogued their fears, and identified which children would be most vulnerable to her particular form of spiritual delusion. The newspaper clippings from other counties revealed a pattern spanning decades: missing children, ritualistic elements, and always a helpful community member who'd assisted with searches while harboring the very secrets being sought. Martha had perfected her methods over years of practice, learning to manipulate grief-stricken parents and desperate communities with surgical precision. Carlos realized with sickening clarity that Martha was still cooking meals at the ranch, still moving through her daily routines with that same quiet efficiency, still watching and waiting for the next opportunity to serve her twisted spiritual purpose. The arrest came at dawn when Martha was beginning her morning preparations in the ranch kitchen. Sheriff Santos found her methodically grinding herbs, with a mortar and pestle, her movements as steady and purposeful as they'd been for 19 years. She looked up when the officers entered, and for just a moment, her mask of gentle competence slipped. Behind her weathered features, Carlos glimpsed something ancient and hungry, a predator that had learned to wear the face of kindness. She didn't resist. She didn't deny. She simply set down her pestle and asked if she might finish preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. Even in custody, her first instinct was to feed people to maintain the facade of nurturing care that had concealed her true nature for so long. The confession came in fragments over the following days, delivered in the same measured tone she'd used to discuss recipes and remedies. Martha described her actions with clinical detachment, as if reporting on someone else's behaviour. The voices had been very clear, she explained. The boys had been chosen. Their innocence made them perfect vessels for the spiritual transformation the land required. She'd led them to the petroglyphs that night, telling them stories about ancient magic, while the peyote she'd given them earlier took full effect. They'd been compliant, even curious, as she'd arranged the ritual circle and spoken of their important role in saving the ranch. The end had been quick, a mercy. She insisted, though, her definition of mercy belonged to a reality no one else could comprehend. The community struggled to reconcile the woman they'd known with the monster she'd revealed herself to be. Ranch hands, who'd gratefully eaten her meals, felt physically sick, remembering her gentle touches when they'd been injured. Parents whose children had played near her kitchen experienced nightmares about what might have happened if circumstances had been different. As the investigation concluded and Martha was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility, Carlos looked at the petroglyphs one last time. The ancient symbols seemed less ominous now, just old stories carved in stone, bearing witness to human joy and sorrow across countless generations. The real journey was just beginning, the slow work of healing a community that had harbored evil without knowing it. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but truth endures patient as the desert itself. As Carlos drove away from the Double C Ranch toward a future unburdened by its terrible secrets, he carried with him a hard-won understanding. Some scars take time to heal, he murmured to the empty cab, but they will heal. The high desert stretched endlessly ahead, promising redemption for those brave enough to seek it one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.